Saber has got an angry bull by the horns in Space Marine 2, and it's turning into a bare-knuckle brawl, as patch 4.0 has turned out to be a bit of a mixed bag. Welcome to the channel. This is LtBuzzLitebeer, and fans of the 40K franchise have been extremely vocal about the recent changes installed into the game. You see, the difficulty has been scaled up dramatically. Armor is down, ammo is reduced, and the spawns are simply off the Richter scale, leading to players resorting to their now proven method of fighting back against studios' negative Steam reviews. Now clearly, Saber seems to have fallen prey to their own micro bubble of praise and feedback, listening to the crowd that felt the game was too easy, and for many, falling into all the same potholes Helldivers went through. Now, when your game shifts this dramatically, this quickly, it may be great for some, but for many others, it's just too much of a shock for the system, which is what I want to take a look at today. Before we dive into this one, if you haven't already, hit subscribe and take a few moments to ring that notifications bell to receive my latest upload alerts. What has happened to Saber and Space Marines 2? Well, let's find out. It's not all bad for the studio, though, and their breakout Warhammer hit. I mean, it sold incredibly well, now passing 4.5 million sales in its first month, clearly tapping a vein, not only with 40K faithful, but a whole new generation of fans. Now, this past weekend, with little fanfare I might add, Saber dropped the promised 4K texture pack as an optional install for both Steam and Epic PC players, if they had the hardware firepower to handle the monstrous 91 gig update. And for those of you keeping track, the 4K pack is bigger than the entire base game file size, pushing Space Marine 2 up to nearly 160 gigs in total file size if you choose to download this beautiful new coat of paint. Now, does it add some bling to the visuals? Yes, you bet. How about the performance? Surely it must obliterate those frames. Well, surprisingly, no. Minimum specs to run the texture pack at 30 FPS with ultra settings include 12 CPU cores, 16 gigs of RAM, and a graphics card with at least 12 gigs of VRAM. But hold on, if you want the full Monty, Saber is tasking you with something more in line with an AMD Ryzen 9 7300X 3D or an Intel i9 14900K, and again, those same 12 gigs of VRAM. So a GPU akin to an AMD Radeon RX 7900 XTX or a Geforce RTX 4070 Super, with reports from users who have experimented with the pack that in reality, you're going to want 16 or 24 gigs of VRAM to go full tilt, pushing the GPU requirements up to top shelf or else. Speaking of top shelf, let's hear a quick word from today's sponsor, Factor. Have you ever felt that your diet might not be the best? Come on, don't give me that. We're parents and gamers. We run off chips and sodas on most days, but at some point, we gotta get our eating habits in shape, and today's sponsor, Factor, is the perfect solution. One of my goals this year, besides more dive time, of course, is getting back into shape, and nutrition is the key to making that happen. Now, since I stay locked in all day long, I'm always running out of time, and the first thing to be sacrificed is a good meal. But with Factor, I can have fresh meals arrive to my front door already prepared and ready to eat in just 2 minutes, which is clutch for hectic lifestyles like mine. Their menus are updated weekly and include over 35 meals and 60 add-on options. There's keto, calorie smart, chef's choice, and vegan plus veggie options here to choose from, all prepared by chefs and approved by dietitians. They even offer a wide variety of smoothies, juices, snack bites, and more to keep me fueled up and working at peak levels. Factor really fit into my daily routine, and it might just do the same for you. Head over to factor75.com or click the link below and use this code LtBuzzOCT50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. That's factor75.com, code LtBuzzOCT50 for 50% off your first box and 20% off your next month of orders. And start eating better today. Again, referencing that 4K texture pack, and it really takes what was a very good-looking game to simply stunning. Of course, at the expense of huge amounts of uncompressed file space and the obvious need to have a very stout PC rig to actually enjoy it to the fullest. One final item of note here is the fact that Saber published the 4K texture pack but made it optional, earning praise from the PC community. You see, many studios and publishers would force a graphical update onto the whole of the PC player base, leaving many scrambling to deal with the changes to performance, but Saber left it in the players' hands, which is great to see. Not optional, however, was last week's patch 4.0, literally turning the game on its head. Leaning into arguments that the game was too easy, Saber went hard into the paint, changing items like the all-spec scan and melted charges versus bosses, and reducing armor values on both ruthless and substantial difficulties. Ammo restrictions were put in place, idle spawn timers were tweaked, enemy variety and spawn densities were also changed. Extremist enemies could now appear en masse, which was all well and good for the newly introduced lethal difficulty, the highest tier of difficulty now in the game, but for many, this was a bridge too far. Overnight, the game went from more geared to casual players with the ability to get into trouble on Ruthless to the now present, a much more unforgiving gaming experience. Saber had flipped the script on operations, catering to those that were calling for a ramp up in difficulty. Now, this extreme shift would have landed just those few percentage points softer if it were not for another game that recently went through all the same pain points as this game. And of course, we're talking about Helldivers 2. Now, Arrowhead's breakout success started off incredibly strong. I mean, we can see the player counts, 12 million plus copies sold, but through a series of punishing and baffling nerfs to player weapons, while simultaneously making the enemy combatants even stronger than before, the player base dwindled down to near flatline levels of players. Gone was that overpowered player power fantasy players saw at launch, replaced by a Tarkov in space sweatfest. And those players responded. For each successive ill-received update to the game, they took to Steam and they punished the review and comment sections. But more importantly, those players, those once loyal Helldivers, left. They had seen enough. Now, to their credit, Arrowhead has spent the last 60 or so days reforming their core player experience, and admittedly, as someone that is roughly 500 hours sunk into Helldivers, I can confirm that the game plays dramatically better after all the recent changes. And for many, it is simply an overall better performing game than it even was at launch. But you see, games and gamers are not always on the same page. A studio has a brief window in which to capture and keep a gamer's attention, and once it is lost, it can stay lost forever. And this is where Space Marine 2 enters the picture, and the historical similarities are so very familiar between these two studios and these games. Studio has breakout hit, exceeds their wildest expectations for sales, and then falls down the rabbit hole of listening to its own echo chamber of desires to change the game coming from the vocal minority, shaping it into a game for the few instead of a game for the many. It nearly cost Arrowhead and Helldivers everything, and for many, they saw the exact same trends and mistakes being made by Saber, which is why the Helldivers 2 references are seen all over social media. How could Space Marine 2 fall into all the same traps players saw Helldivers go through, especially since it was so fresh on players' minds? Arrowhead has only just concluded their 60-day plan to save the game, and so when Saber stumbled into the same bed of thorns, it had players just literally shaking their heads. How could they do this? How could Saber make the same mistakes that so clearly cost Helldivers so dearly? The structural, logical, and dare I say, defined answer to that question, we may never know. But the results of patch 4.0 sent a literal shockwave through this community. Now, to be fair, for some, they embraced this scaling up in difficulty. For them, they wanted the ultimate, hardcore, gritty, kill or be killed ultramarine fantasy, and 4.0 gave them exactly that. But there was this other, silent majority of players that were just here for the power trip, man. For them, lumbering through the mud, firing larger-than-life weapons at endless waves of enemies was the ultimate hardcore experience, with everything else just serving as a bonus. And so when 4.0 dropped on them with the force of an assault's hammer strike, the change was just too much. Even the operations setup and tutorials were caught off guard just based on the recommended levels Saber has posted in-game. You see, operations were set up to push players up the ladder for difficulty, gradually feeding in more power to their suits and their weapons. Minimal was starting off at level 1. Average recommended players be at level 5. Substantial was level 10, and the tops was Ruthless, recommending level 15 and upwards. All while a player could exceed the operations levels, pushing their abilities up to level 25 and their weapons through 4 tiers of progression, ending at Relic tier. And here's the part in this story where Saber just lost its damn mind. You see, players had progressed upwards with enough speed that for some, they were now trivializing Ruthless difficulty. Once classes and weapons were fully maxed, the ability to crush hundreds of foes was made even easier, and the vocal minority started wanting more. Saber then reacted, which can be characterized as a knee-jerk reaction, which by the way is never a good idea, and they leaned into this narrative that the game was too easy. And since they were seeing it online, since they were seeing it in their Discord over on Reddit, then it must be true, and it must be true for all players. Notice I said all, which takes us back to earlier when we made reference to the huge portion of the player base that is new to Warhammer. You see, for them, they were most definitely not here to get the crap beat out of them while trying to enjoy their time in the service of the Emperor. And here's Saber's critical thinking flaw. They took the vocal minority of the feedback, the loudest portion, calling to make the game exceedingly more difficult, as gospel. And they overtuned, they overcorrected, when in reality, they didn't need to change a damn thing. You see, Act 2 of Saber's Patch 4.0 plans was the unveiling of their new operations difficulty, the hardest of the hard, Lethal, which took everything up to extreme levels. Now players were met with huge swarms of enemies, massive amounts of ranged attacks, very brief periods between spawns, and extreme enemies spawning in upon extreme enemies. It was everything and then some the 1%ers had been screaming for. For those strong enough to finish all 7 operations on lethal difficulty, new cosmetics awaited them to highlight their absolute mastery of the game. This was all that Patch 4.0 needed. Saber could have stopped there. They just throw the truly hardcore their bone and be done with it. But again, with the echoes still ringing in their ears, they then stepped into the mid and slightly higher difficulty tiers, imposing odd new reductions in player power. Less armor and less ammo met players on Ruthless. Less armor as well on Substantial, which, as we mentioned earlier, was set up for level 10 players. It's a springboard used during the onboarding process as players come to grips with dealing with more enemies and more perks and more powerful weapons they now have at their disposal. Enter the hidden plot twist to our tale, the unnamed menace, the game director itself. Saber's adaptive mechanic AI that is said to take into account player power levels, how experienced a player is with a class, along with overall success rates, and it somehow mashes that all together. It adapts to those power deltas. It is there to provide a more interesting and immersive player experience. It's there to create a positive number. But ever since patch 4.0, the game director has been spiraling out of control. And this is an item I don't see mentioned enough, and it's certainly missing in Saber's patch notes. Now, players were not only dealing with reductions to armor and ammo, depending on difficulty levels, but the enemy spawn mechanics were reaching absurd levels, comboed with increased high-level enemies spawning in back-to-back, sometimes in tandem, and players who had maybe been a reliable, substantial tier player aspiring to move up to Ruthless tier were now being slaughtered in a game mode and difficulty they were accustomed to enjoying. Speaking from personal experience, I have multiple classes, all leveled up to max. I've been a Ruthless tier player for a while now. I also enjoy the challenge of lethal difficulty, but Also will choose to bump down a tier and select Ruthless when I don't want the added hardcore elements tacked on that lethal difficulty brings, especially the forced tight formation mechanic. And just looking objectively at the changes that Saber made, but more importantly, how they are translating into live gameplay, and the spawn rates and mob densities, even on Substantial, have gotten out of control. Harkening back to my comment about the game director and Saber just losing their damn minds. Not touching Substantial or Ruthless difficulty while piling it all on with Lethal was the perfect play here. But their 1-2 punch of reductions in player power, along with the game director being cranked up to absurd, it's just simply too much. Again, Substantial tier used to be a stepping stone where players could get more familiar with their chosen classes with a little added difficulty tacked on, along with a small chance of seeing Extremis or even Terminus level enemies. Well, that's been thrown out the window by this game director, and here's a prime example of that. You see, I logged on this morning, I hit the matchmaker, and I dropped into the new termination operation on Substantial with 2 other random players. Now, they had already cleared about 2/3 of the mission before I ever arrived, but when I finally did manage to load in, I was met with a Carnifex battle in progress and one player at damn near death. About a minute after we downed the Carnifex, we were met with a Lictor. In the next chamber, which was very confined and had difficult sightlines, we got another Terminus level enemy, a Neurothrope. Now, for those of you keeping score, that's 2 Terminus level targets within about 5 minutes of each other, which is absurd to think about since Substantial difficulty used to have a very slight chance of seeing them at all, and this was designed for level 10 players. We were all level 25s. To finish this up, we had a second Lictor jump us while aiming the cannon at the high boss, not to mention the overwhelming massive enemy spawns of Gaunts and dozens upon dozens of warriors firing thorns all over the place. My described experience there is just one small microcosm of the greater Space Marine player experience, and of course this was immediately met with resistance. Saber had gone too far. This was not the game gamers had bought and enjoyed at launch, and just like Helldivers and their failed Escalation of Freedom update, players started leaving the game, and the player counts show us that. Gamers also took to social media, deploying the only tactic studios seem to respond to these days: negative press. Steam reviews plummeted. Social sites like Reddit were set ablaze. Obviously, Saber had majorly screwed up. They had taken the game in a direction they thought would be embraced, but instead, it was actually being shunned. Well, what happens now? Luckily, it didn't take 60 days or 6 months for them to correct course. I'm looking at you, Helldivers. And a public announcement was made acknowledging the error, and a new correction would be incoming and incoming soon. The pressing question is, what is this new adjustment Saber is set to make, and will it be enough to persuade players to return? In all probability, my guess would be yes. The core gameplay and player power fantasy are still oozing out of Space Marine 2. It still gets the dopamine hit flowing like very few other games on the market right now, but Saber just learned a very valuable lesson in player wants, needs, and desires. How much they pull back on the lesser difficulty nerfs while getting a handle on their now out-of-control game director, well, that remains to be seen. Social media is not what gamers want. Discord is not their voice. Reddit is not the end-all be-all of reading the tea leaves. Most players have no idea that Saber made all these changes. They don't keep up on the latest patch notes, and honestly, they don't care. They just log in, they hack and slash, and they leave with a grin, hopefully from ear to ear. But when they boot up the game and all of a sudden it's a complete 180 from what they previously enjoyed, they shut it off and they move on. Hopefully this week, Saber will unveil their correction to patch 4.0, and I really hope they've done their homework here, because this game absolutely can kick ass. I want it to do well. I want them, the studio, to do well, because I like seeing great games come out of obscurity to take the marketplace by storm. Lesson learned for Saber? I don't know. Fingers crossed, because this game deserves to stay on top. Remember to hit subscribe and ring that notifications bell to receive my latest upload alerts. All my socials, including links to all of today's sources, can be found in the video description. A massive shout out to the nearly 246,000 of you incredible ladies and gents from across the planet who've already taken the plunge, you've hit subscribe, and you tune in daily to support me and my channel. Until the next one, this is LtBuzzLitebeer, signing off.